invite up, we've got two terrific panelists. I'm going to invite them up and maybe just ask them to say a few words about themselves. Let me invite up Dr. Joseph Wilson and Lawrence Lerner. And rather than reading the lengthy bio I've been given for both of you, I'll invite you up and ask you to say a quick word about yourselves. And then I've got some questions for you, and then we can just open things up. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Lawrence Lerner. I'm the CEO of Pythia. We're a blockchain venture capital fund based here in Washington, headquartered in Seattle. We just took our fourth investment. We're always looking to help build the blockchain ecosystem around what's going on in Washington State and beyond. I have 25 years in the industry as a technologist, helping launch everyday technologies, Discover Card, Motorola's smartphone, and started working in crypto in the late 90s, so it's always been a passion.
I'm Joseph Williams. I'm Governor Inslee's ICT sector lead. What that means is I provide a lot of policy guidance to the governor, his policy people, and the other state agencies and legislators. And I do a lot of work trying to promote the economic development of the blockchain and crypto ecosystem. So, big proponent of what's going on here.
So maybe to start off with, I'll piggyback on something I said in my remarks, and that is there's a broad diversity of knowledge when it comes to technology among elected officials. I still have colleagues who don't use email or a cell phone. That's not a joke. And certainly when we deal with security issues, as you saw in the hearings with some of the large social media companies, that becomes a real barrier to thoughtful policy making, certainly in our nation's capital. So how do you overcome, I'm a 44-year-old guy who worked in technology, and it took me a while to have some facility on this. How do you overcome that barrier?
Wow. I think it comes to making things every day. It's got to be relatable. If you're taking a technology and you're starting with, hey, let me explain a web server to you, it's not super intuitive or interesting, and it's not what somebody does every day. But if you're saying, here's a different way to do a transaction and to store your data and make sure that it's more reliable and final and kept out of the hands of the people it shouldn't, I think it's the way we present the data and educate people. I think it always comes down to education and the way you present it.
Let me add to that. I'm not sure it's that critical that you be able to understand what's happening under the covers. I think you have to understand how the role it plays and how your company or your ecosystem can use it. But I lift the hood up of the car, I look at it, and I think to myself, wow, I have no idea what any of this is, but I'm pretty good at driving the car and making it work. So I think blockchain in some way is the same. I don't expect the electeds, and I talk to a lot of state-level electeds, they don't need to understand how blockchain actually writes the block and the whole proof of work and consensus, but they really need to understand that blockchain has value and it can do interesting things.
Yeah. So you've seen some countries really lean in on this. The New Yorker, if you haven't read it, a year or so ago, did an article on Estonia's effort to provide more services using blockchain technology. As you've looked at what governments have done, either other countries or other states, any takeaways, any lessons for the state of Washington and for the United States?
Well, I'll start on that. So Estonia is interesting. They use guard time, which is actually more of a distributed ledger than a public blockchain. But what they've done is they took a look at the fact that they are very close to Russia, and in the event of a Russian incursion of any kind, how do we preserve the data that makes Estonia Estonia? And so they had a business problem or a government problem, and they saw that distributed ledger technologies could be a very important way to approach it. And from that perspective, government gets good outcomes. But if government says, hey, blockchain's really cool, how do I use it? You end up with weird and poorly incentivized results. And so governments have to be very smart in how they think about it. And a great example in the state of Washington is we're talking to companies about how do you do voters? How do you vote online? And we have a lot of servicemen and women, particularly in your district, and congrats on your primary win, by the way. And servicemen and women serving abroad, it's hard for them to vote. So if we could do some kind of blockchain sort of thing, that would be very interesting. So we have a problem, and we're trying to solve that problem. Now, there's all kinds of Department of Homeland Security issues attached to that, but that's a lot better than saying, well, how do we use blockchain in trying to do some kind of education thing? We don't know what it is, but we just want to use it. And it's not as focused, it's not as interesting, and not as easy to work on.
Yeah, and I think it's well said. Take a business first approach and separate the conversation between what's cryptocurrency. I mean, they're very tied, and the economics of transactions are really important. But if you separate it, and China's an interesting example, because everybody looks at China as this huge wall of, no pun intended, of we really hate crypto and we're locking down on it. Yes, they are. The governments, and rightly so, are all concerned about defrauding citizens and what it might do to the monetary system. But if you look on the flip side, Shenzhen province is using it for legal stature, so you can actually put information out onto the blockchain and use it as evidence in trials. So governments that are taking thoughtful inspection of where you can use it from a business, and I'm not saying regulate it way later, but then you can look at it and say, all right, how does this fit? Because when we did that with the internet, it was really clear. The internet was, it's telecommunications. We've got some rules around it. We can drive through that, and we need to make some changes. I mean, we could go on this because this is really interesting around data. So I'll pause there because it's a deep question.
Well, I mean, you touched on, I think, an important point that's generally true as those of you in the room engage policymakers. To me, there's sort of two streams here. One is an education stream, making sure people understand what this is and what it means and why there's value. And then second is an advocacy approach, where the starting point needs to be what's the problem you're trying to solve, or what's the opportunity that you're trying to embrace. Why is it a legitimate opportunity, or why is it a legitimate problem? And then how can this technology either embrace that opportunity or solve that problem? I think that, where I've seen thoughtful advocacy happen, that's how it's happened. So my encouragement to you, if your intent is to engage policymakers, I think that's one important thing to think about. One, how do you educate policymakers, including some who don't have a technology most of whom don't have a technology background, and two, what do you want them to do, and help make clear why that's a legitimate problem or opportunity for them to engage on. Let me ask you this. So as you've dug into this space, have you discovered particular barriers to growth here in our state, here in our country, either from a regulatory standpoint, from a workforce standpoint, or other areas where you think, man, this may be an area where policymakers need to focus some attention?
Yeah, great question. So the short answer is no, not yet. I mean, on the crypto side, there's absolutely a lot of questions. How much power are we consuming? Is it good for us? Are these frauds? Are they scams? But on the blockchain side, it's actually more questions from a workforce standpoint. We're net, Washington State has got a net deficit of somewhere between 17 and 19,000 tech workers. And we're investing as a company to build education. We're actually going out to Wenatchee to help build programs there. So from a legislator standpoint, I think the questions, the obvious and easy one is, how can this technology help grow economic empowerment in my district, in my area? And what do we need to feed you? So I'll turn the question a little bit back, because you've got the best audience in the state right in front of you. What can we feed to you? What information can we give you that helps you understand it and elevate that dialogue so that you help us, to really help you enable prosperity in the state?
Yeah, I guess I'd say a couple things on that front, particularly with regard to the workforce development challenge and just the number of jobs that are available broadly in technology that require computer science capability broadly. I think there could be a lot more education done to policymakers and, frankly, to education leaders here in our state. You've seen in some areas, and I think, to her credit, one of your last panelists, Janine Toronto, has done a terrific job of being engaged with the local school district, with the University of Washington Tacoma. As a consequence, years back, the UW-Tacoma created a new master's degree program in cybersecurity. Now they're talking about blockchain capabilities, and historically we've done a poor job. Writ large, have done a poor job of skating to where the puck is going to be, right? Education generally chases the opportunity, sometimes a few years late, sometimes a whole lot of years late. And to the extent that you all, as leaders in this space, can engage education leaders, the benefit will accrue to you. We're working on this from a policy standpoint, too, in our nation's capital. I mentioned we've got a bill that's focused on broadening apprenticeships and our kind of historic view of apprenticeship to include technology opportunities and jobs in the tech industry. We are working on legislation to try to provide more funds for partnerships between K-12 schools and industry. And one of the other things that we're looking at is being able to upskill your existing workforce so that as new technology emerges, you're not just depending upon the pipeline out of our higher education institutions, that they're able to continue their education. We've introduced a bill that would set up something called lifelong learning accounts that would be optional, and they would be an optional and portable employee benefit, not unlike a health savings account or a 401k. Employer could pay in, employee could pay in, both would see some tax benefit for that contribution. And an employee who's in a job could use it to go get smart about something outside of their current role. That's the type of thing, those are the type of tools that we're trying to add to our workforce development toolbox so that businesses like yours can be successful in finding people. Do you have anything you want to add on this front? Or?
Yeah, let me add two things. One, on the crypto side, Washington does have some relatively, by the standards of Wyoming, strict rules around anti-money laundering and money transfers. That's deliberate. It's a state policy. Does it get in the way of economic development? It hurts our brand as a state. And if you actually compare the state of Washington to 48 other states, we're in great shape. Compared to Wyoming, we're a little different. But if you've been to Wyoming, they've got to do what they've got to do to attract anything to show up, right? The other thing, well, I am a homie for the state, right? The other thing I'll mention is there's a lot of uncertainty. I think we have one law firm here that says on the blockchain side, we don't need any change in legislation to make smart contracts work. I've got another major law firm that says we do. So I don't know. As I try to do policy guidance to the state legislature, I don't know whether we need to change the rules or not. And so we need a lot of public input as to whether there's sufficiency in the regulatory environment to do what you need to do. And smart contracts are going to be a big part of this, right?
Yeah.
I want to make sure we open it up to the audience for some questions, but I'm going to ask you, and then I would also, if anyone in the audience has a suggestion, I want to end our discussion not dissimilar to the end of the last panel discussion, which is if you were giving direction to policymakers, to members of Congress, if I airdropped you into the U.S. Capitol, other than running screaming for the door, what would you do? Are there things that you think could help us embrace this opportunity to make how government works better and more secure, to create more economic opportunity in this space?
Let me do mine. And then
Okay, go for it.
So we expect that the Department of Homeland Security will very quickly or very soon issue a report saying that blockchain is important for the national infrastructure and national security. And there'll probably be some kind of appropriation attached to that. How do you and Congressman Heck, because you're both on the blockchain caucus, how do you ensure that comes back to Washington? Or some of it comes back to Washington? Because that's very important for us.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open up two things. We've almost exclusively talked about technology today, but blockchain also has a sense of decentralization around voting and the way that people come to consensus, and something that you mentioned in your last open letter to your constituents. So what I would suggest to Congress is say, think about the things that can be decentralized, specifically around data, infrastructure, things at NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, that could be distributed, maybe not to everybody, but the 50 states. How does that make it more robust, fault tolerant? We mentioned Estonia earlier. Blockchain has that level of finality and interdependence and independence that allows you to prevent things from falling down in one place. As we know, the banking industry has already started putting some information onto blockchain is in the form of fault tolerance. So what would the things that are priorities for Congress to protect as they provide infrastructure? I'd ask, and again, from a very relatable, simple way to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The capacity for federal agencies and certainly for Congress to adopt new technologies, even in the face of significant challenge, has been very poor. There's been a very poor record. I mean, you've continued to see this debate, and there are some agencies that are running decades-old technologies and trying to put patches on it, rather than and not to mention the fact that so much is done from a technology standpoint in-house rather than using commercial technologies. That really impedes our ability to, as a nation, to adopt new technology. So that's certainly something that those of us who care about this are trying to at least socialize within the Congress. So with that, let's open it up.
Yeah, I just want to start a question from Twitter. I want to encourage everybody to tweet your questions. This is one from Twitter coming from Crypto Dragon. Are there any blockchain use cases you personally are excited about in terms of potential benefits for the U.S. government?
Digital identity, self-sovereign. I mean, we play host to Sovereign here, Evernym, Life ID, Trust2Key, so many companies that are using digital identity to take back the control of your own information and to be able to manage it and actually enable a higher degree of security. That's probably one of the most exciting ones.
I think if you think about self-sovereign identity, the current objects for identity are, 2 of them are owned by the state, birth certificates and driver's licenses, and 2 are owned by the federal government, your passport and however you pay your taxes, and those sorts of things. And the states and the federal government, if we're going to make self-sovereign identity work, need to collaborate on what that solution is going to look like, and it's going to be very complicated. And so, but that's a big opportunity, because who are we as citizens of the United States? That's an issue that's very current at the moment.
Yeah, and I think the unique opportunity in this space when it comes to managing your digital identity is the capacity to do this in a more private and more secure way. In the piece in the New Yorker, and again, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to, it talks about you're moving away from having to fear Big Brother to being able to manage Little Brother and even, beat up Little Brother if you're not happy about how your identity is being managed.
And in a very real way, by the way, there is other identities. You have your Facebook identity and your social media identities, and those are very complicated as well. So,
other questions from the room or any direction to either state policymakers, federal policymakers?
I have a question on the policy side. I'm Canadian, but I think policy development is pretty consistent everywhere you go. So when you have, let's say, a blockchain commercial solution that can actually address a real problem that exists, how do policymakers interpret that so that, they don't like to put the finger on the scale to say I'm going to benefit this commercial enterprise? But have you got any insights as to how to thread that needle?
Yeah, I can at least speak to how it works at the federal level, and then maybe you can talk about at the state level. I think particularly as Congress moved away from earmarks in the appropriations process, more and more power has transitioned to the executive branch and to executive level agencies when it comes to the take-up of new technologies. what that means is the role of legislators is often to try to make introductions to those agency decision makers, where a commercial provider is given an opportunity to say, all right, here's how our technology works, how it could be beneficial to the taxpayer, how it could be beneficial to the end user. But policymakers are not sort of stipulating you must use this technology or use that technology. The only other thing I would say is where you can engage policymakers is by opening up the problem statement or opening up the opportunity by saying, oftentimes you'll see either in the appropriations process or in, say, the defense bill, you'll see report language that says, hey, come up with a plan for solving this problem. And oftentimes the solution may be tied very closely to a solution provided by a technology provider.
So at the state level, it's similar to that, except that our legislature could, in fact, direct an agency to do something with a specific technology. That would either come with money, which would be good, or it would not come with money, which is more common and bad. But there's also state agencies which on their own could say, hey, I've got a problem. I need to update the way I do fishing licenses, for example. How do I do that? And they could approach vendors from that. So they could either encourage vendors to come in and bid for something, or they could react to a vendor coming in and saying, have you thought about a new way to do fishing licenses? But literally at the state, if it doesn't come with an appropriation, it is extremely difficult to get it done. We're not good at taking big risks with technology.
I saw another hand somewhere. Go ahead. And then I got
It is a comment rather than a question, but we in the United States, it's pretty often cyclically known by the internet. I would submit to you that the blockchain is probably the first major innovation in over a century where America does not lead. And I would like to ask you to try to do something.
I don't know if the folks on that side of the room heard the question or statement, but it was a statement raising concern about America, for the first time, unreeling a cutting-edge innovation not leading the way. I think that's a legit concern, and it's why we've created this caucus in the Congress to try to at least get policymakers thinking about how America could regain leadership in this arena. I think there are bigger challenges, though, as well, in the sense that, you saw the National Academies a decade and a half ago lay out a report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, which laid out, here are the things the United States is going to need to do if it's going to be competitive in a dramatically changing world economy. And it suggested, for example, a dramatic increase in funding for basic research, a dramatic increase in investment in workforce development, particularly in burgeoning industries. And what you've largely seen policymakers do with that report is ignore it. And I think that is at our own peril economically and from a security standpoint.
I'll just point out, we think Satoshi was American, right?
Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Representative Derek Kilmer, Joseph Williams, Lawrence. Thank you so much.